Awesome. Wow. It is 1:02. We've got a couple more folks joining, but in the interest of time, we've got a great agenda for today. So let's go ahead and get started. Pardon me, excuse me. So first of all, I just want to welcome everyone. Good afternoon, folks. My name is Michelle Leidenberg. I'm a senior manager of data and learning at Interact for Health, and it is such a pleasure to be here with all of you this afternoon to talk about evaluation and learning, my favorite thing to talk about. And so excited to have Corey and Rebecca here from Innovation Network. They bring a ton of expertise on evaluation and learning and capacity building. So we're just so jazzed to have them here. And I also want to say thank you to all of our grantee partners who expressed interest in learning more about evaluation and learning. We appreciate your insights and your suggestions for training, and we hope that this will help spark some amazing conversation and some learning for all of our grantee partners and beyond. And so with that, like I said, you can turn off your camera if you would like, since, like I said, it's a big group. But we are just so excited to have you and excited to have Innovation Network. And I will turn it over to Corey and Rebecca. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, Michelle. So, hi, everyone. My name is Corey Georgopoulos. I use she, her pronouns. I've been in evaluation for about 5 years now, and I've worked with a variety of clients, including nonprofits, philanthropy, and government. And this is my colleague, Rebecca. Pass it to her.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Perlmutter, she, her pronouns. I've been working in evaluation for about 13 years, mostly focused on policy advocacy evaluation.
Thank you. And Michelle's excited to have us. Well, we're happy to be here. We're really excited to talk to you about evaluation and learning, and really just sharing a bit about how we approach our own work. So you'll be hearing a bit about like some of our past projects, and we'll weave that through the presentation. But before we get started, just a little housekeeping. So as you saw, this session is being recorded, and we're going to share the slides at the end of the session. So no need to write down everything. I know that I usually do during presentations, so rest easy. And then if you have any questions throughout the sessions, please just feel free to drop them in the chat. I can't promise we'll get to all of them because we have a pretty packed presentation, but we'll try our best. And then finally, if you could just please stay muted so we can reduce background noise, that would be lovely. Okay, final thing before we get started is throughout the presentation, we'll have a couple opportunities where we'd like to hear from you, including right now. So we'll be using this platform called Menti, and Rebecca's going to drop the link in the chat right now. Or if you want, you can scan this QR code to pull up the website on your phone. And so the first thing we'd like to ask is, if you had to describe evaluation in one word based on your previous experience, what word would that be? And no profanity. I know people's experiences with evaluation can be very mixed, including my own. Love it. See some responses coming in. Tedious, yes, it certainly can be. Complex, absolutely. Yeah, frustrating. Yep. I do it for a living and it can still be very frustrating. Yeah. Perfect. So, I mean, yeah, evaluation is a lot of things. It can be all these amazing things. It can be really rewarding. It can be insightful. And you're right that it can be like really hard sometimes. It can be tedious. It can be frustrating, like wrangling all the people who need to participate, for sure. So hopefully throughout the course of this session, we will try to like make it a little less frustrating and a little less complex and kind of make it more of these better things. We'll try to make it useful and we'll try to make it rewarding. So thank you all for sharing. Great. So here's our agenda for today, and I just wanted to provide a little framing for the session. So first, we're not going to cover everything in evaluation. There are just so many ways to do evaluation, and we can really only cover like a small portion of it today. But it may still feel overwhelming, and that's okay. This is why we're sharing like the recording slides, and you'll see like at the end of each section, we also have additional resources for you to revisit later. So the goal of this session is really for you to just understand the basics and to at least know where to start looking as you begin to undertake some evaluation activities. So this is not meant, you're not going to come away from this being like an expert, but you'll have a bit of a roadmap. And just as a final note here before we get into the content, everything we're presenting today did not just spring from our minds. Far from it, honestly. We draw on so many sources, including some of our own work. But there are so many really smart people doing amazing things out there, and we're definitely going to share some of their work with you too. And I mean, we're constantly learning as well, so like maybe you know some stuff that we haven't heard of yet, quite frankly. And so let's see. So before we get into like just evaluation basics, I wanted to just like share a little bit of information and history about evaluation, because I think it's important and really provides a necessary context for where the practice is today. So historically, evaluation has been kind of like an accountability tool for social policies starting in like the early 20th century. And today it's moving to be more participatory and learning focused. Fun fact, you're probably wondering why there's a replica of Sputnik up on this slide. It's because the Sputnik launch helped develop and accelerate the field of evaluation. It made a lot of Americans realize, or at least feel like they were losing the space race against the Soviet Union. And it really made them question the effectiveness of their education system. So if you hate evaluation or you love it, you can thank the Cold War for that. Obviously, there are other factors, but I thought that was a fun fact. On another note, evaluation is something that has been done in the name of efficiency, has a really high likelihood of causing harm, and it has. Evaluation, for example, is definitely being used to monitor and reduce government spending at times, which obviously can impact people who are dependent on like government funds. And its history is also really intertwined with research, and I think we all know how much harm research has caused in the past. In philanthropy itself, it's also certainly been used as a tool to keep rich white men rich, right? And in practice today, while evaluation has like grown and I think become better, it can still be really burdensome, especially for smaller organizations. And it's not always done with utility or real learning in mind. But we have a lot of people in the field trying to change that, including ourselves. And so we want to share some tools and resources to help you make evaluation useful too. I'll just add one thing and say that funders also have a really varied perspective on evaluation and learning. And I want to just acknowledge that that adds tension and complicates how organizations feel like they can or should approach evaluation. And so hopefully this just gives you a tiny bit of context for evaluation. And from here, I'll just turn it over to Rebecca so she can introduce you to some evaluation basics.
All right, so in this section, we just sort of want to help you begin to understand what evaluation is and isn't, just so you can really start to feel more empowered in undertaking it. And like Corey said, and it's probably going to be a theme that we say throughout, like we acknowledge the reality that evaluation can be burdensome. It can be a funder requirement, but we also think it can be beneficial for your own work and for your organizations. And so here we just want to share some of the frameworks and principles that inform our own evaluation practice. These are just two quotes that resonate with us, definitions of evaluation. I'll just read the second one. It's a systematic and intentional process of gathering and analyzing data, both quantitative and qualitative, to inform learning, decision-making, and action. So we're going to stress learning a lot, decision-making, and action a lot in this presentation. And so there are a couple of things that evaluation shouldn't be, but then acknowledging what Corey said, like it has somewhat of a fraught history. So these are things that perhaps it has been and can still be, but we're trying to avoid these things. So it shouldn't be a checkbox. But this can be tough, right? Funder requirements are real. They can be time consuming. It also shouldn't be value-free or objective. We try as evaluators to acknowledge our own positionality as well as the power that we hold as evaluators. And so we try to mitigate the biases that we bring to projects, but we also acknowledge that this is not neutral. What we're doing is not neutral. And then lastly, it should not be an inaccessible black box. We want evaluation to be useful and we want it to be understandable. And so there are many reasons why we use evaluation. Again, funder requirement, but we also think that you can use that as an advantage as a way to secure funding. It's also a tool for communication, telling stories about your work, also sharing the learning more broadly about the work that you're doing and sharing it with the field that you're working in. You can also use it to improve your programming and the work that you're doing. And then, of course, accountability to the communities that you're working with. So sharing that learning back with the communities that you're in or are working with. And then also helping your organization to learn more broadly. And so we have a couple principles that inform our view of evaluation. And so the sort of the three big ones we want to share is that you don't need to be or hire a professional evaluator to be doing evaluative activities. Really, we think it's about framing. And so you probably are already doing evaluative activities, whether you may consider them that or not. So like, for example, advocates I've worked with, they often have debrief calls after intense periods of activities. So that's an evaluative activity because you're reflecting and talking about how something's been done, how it went, like how to improve and how to take the work forward. And then second, for us, we think evaluation can and should be a tool to advance equity and amplify the voices of your community. So the ways that we are creating, using, managing evaluations really should advance progress towards equity. We think evaluation can help speak truth to power. And we also think it's important to advocate for power sharing in an evaluation. So that includes centering communities' learning needs in addition or instead of funders' learning needs. And then lastly, evaluation needs to be useful to you. And so if you don't find it valuable and if you're not going to use the findings, then maybe you want to think about like what's the point of doing it in the first place. And so depending on the project that we're working on, we draw on a variety of different frameworks that we think can be useful. And so a framework isn't quite a recipe for your evaluation, but it's a way of letting you organize your evaluation and really making sure that certain priorities, values, and context are incorporated into the design and execution of your evaluation. So we're going to share a bunch of resources with a bunch of different frameworks, but just one example, one framework that we like to draw on, particularly for policy change focused organizations, is called the Advocacy Strategy Framework. And so, for those of you who are involved in policy advocacy work, you know that change and outcomes can look different in policy work. And so we really want to use a lens that acknowledges that and also lets us articulate change and outcomes in a way that makes sense for the advocacy context. And so there's some distinct features of this framework, including having flexible boundaries. And so having sort of a more expansive definition of the ecosystem you're working in and trying to look beyond just your immediate activities. And then also uncertain timeframes and interim goals. So as you probably know, policy change can take years to achieve. And so we really want to be flexible with the time frame that we're working with. Instead, you know, in addition to ultimately contributing to a particular policy outcome, often you'll have interim outcomes. So steps along the way where you're looking at progress that you want to achieve along the way of, you know, perhaps an ultimate policy outcome. And so having identified interim outcomes, it can help you see if your strategies are on track or where you might need to make adjustments. And then also, it's important that to acknowledge that there are different types of success and also contribution, not attribution. So given the nonlinear nature of policy change, and there are many factors going on that might affect this change, it's important to assess an advocacy effort for more than just its ability to achieve a particular policy goal, and also acknowledging that, you know, the work that you're doing is often done in coalitions and alliances. And there are also other actors outside of your coalition or alliance who are also advocating for the same type of change. And so it's really important to look at others' contributions and not attribute success or failure solely to your own work, since there are so many people involved in the change. And then lastly, the importance of adapted methods, which I guess we would say isn't just specific to advocacy evaluation. It's kind of a through line in our work too, is just not being overly prescriptive about using particular methods, but particularly in advocacy work when the change is not linear, and really just picking and choosing what works for you. And so related to that, don't read this, it's too many words. We're going to share this with you. It has links, but it's just to show there are so many frameworks out there. We'll share this with some sort of top line guidance about when you could use these frameworks. And again, we really like combining frameworks and sort of tailoring to the context and to your situation and to what resonates with you. And some other resources, again, we'll also be sharing this out as well. I mean, there's a lot out there. We've tried to select a few that perhaps we like to go to or refer to and go back to in our work. But again, we'll share this all out with you. And I will turn over to Corey.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca. So we have a bit of an overview of what evaluation is. And so if we're in agreement that evaluations are really about like judging the merit of a piece of work or like learning from it, it would really be useful to have a baseline or at least some articulated assumptions about how we think the work should look if it went perfectly. So if we don't have those basic assumptions laid out, really what you end up doing a lot of the time is you're just going to describe an intervention or activity, which is useful too, but it's not necessarily evaluation in itself. And you might not get what you want out of it as a result. So this is where theories of change come in. And we'll be actually talking, well, you've probably already heard about logic models along with theories of change, but we're really going to be focusing on theories of change, mostly because we think they're particularly helpful to help you articulate like causal pathways and assumptions that underlie your work. So like, for example, if we do X, we think Y will be the outcome because of Z. And theories of change often show other factors not within the scope or control of your work that can affect your outcomes or goals, whereas I feel like logic models usually look more linear and like they can omit why we think certain outcomes come from certain activities. So in general, we tend to use theories of change. And I just want to acknowledge too, like sometimes you'll honestly just see these terms used interchangeably and it can be a bit arbitrary and confusing. But in general, like the intent is the same. They're both seeking to answer the question of like, what do we do and to what ends, right? So on top of helping with evaluation and measuring your work, a lot of other benefits and uses of a theory of change or a logic model can be like they help the organization really reflect on the truths and assumptions that are unspoken within your work. Like you'd be surprised how many people just do work and then never question like why it's necessarily good. And like it can be like you can look at it and think, yes, this is good, but thinking about why that is. It can help you assess if activities and programs are in fact concretely tied to your work's ultimate goal. It can help you really enable your organization to articulate about the work and talk about it in a cohesive way. And so that comes particularly handy when talking to outside stakeholders or like people in the community or even funders. And then finally, we think that theories of change are really helpful to better understand like how your time and resources are being invested, or potentially like should there be a change in how you're doing your work. So going back to Mentee, we're very curious. How many of you already have a logic model or theory of change for your organization or program? And if you're just joining us, Rebecca will put a link to the Mentee in the chat, or you can scan this QR code to join us on your phone. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of yeses. That makes me very happy. Nice. Okay, a lot of I don't knows, which is interesting too. Okay, so yeses, a few no's, some I don't knows. Okay, I have another question for you then. When was the last time you looked at or revisited your theory of change, if you have one? In the last 3 months. Amazing. Never seen it. Okay. Cool. Interesting distribution. Thank you for sharing. And hopefully, so throughout this section, will at least make you curious enough to maybe go search out for your theory of change if your organization has one, or maybe this will inspire you to like maybe approach creating one. And approaching a theory of change can be done in so many ways. And here we're just really going to show you how we did it for one of our clients and some of the general steps you'll take when you create your own. And so this approach itself is based on the work done by the Andy Casey Foundation, which we linked in our resources section. And essentially, this approach breaks the theory of change process down by goals, strategies, and outcomes. So here it's easier to work backwards. So first we define kind of the overarching goal of the work. And when we say goal here, what we're specifically talking about is like something that's very specific, achievable, but ambitious, and usually encompasses a change that's critical for solving a long-term problem. So this is the thing that really all your actions and activities are geared towards. This is like the big picture. So let's look at an example. So the client we worked with works in workplace rights with a focus on serving women and caregivers of color. And they wanted a theory of change to help them articulate the logic and purpose of their work. So this is the goal statement we drafted together, which is caregivers of color are treated equitably in the workplace and are able to care for their own and their family's health and well-being. So when drafting your goal statement, questions to really ask include who or what has changed. So in this case, caregivers of color. And then how are they changed? Which is we would like them to be treated equitably and able to care for their own and their family's health and well-being. Another tip when you're doing this is really think about if like someone was writing an article about your organization or your work in like the next 5 to 10 years. Like what would the headline of that article be and how would it describe the work that you have done or have contributed to? Another tip here is when you're articulating your goal, here it's like really helpful to define almost every key word in your goal to make really explicit the bounds of your work. So like here, what do we mean by caregiver? what does equitable treatment look like? How do we define well-being? And that should help you clarify a lot of the assumptions about your work as well. Okay, so we have our goal and we have the big picture we're striving towards, like our North Star. So really the next step is thinking about the strategies that we're employing to achieve this goal. And these are really just the activities and work that you're doing right now. So this should be really easy to name, usually. So strategies are really just related sets of activities that are needed to implement your program or initiative. It's what you do with program resources in order to achieve program outcomes and ultimately your goal. So let's go back to our example. So to determine what our strategies are, we first ask, and this is super simple, what activities do we do? And then how can these activities be grouped into distinct strategies? This is literally just a level up from listing out individual activities. Grouping really just helps keep the bigger picture in focus and will help make a more concise theory of change too. So this organization does a variety of trainings to teach caregivers their rights and how to advocate for themselves and access legal resources. So this can be thought of as a general education strategy. And then they also provide direct services for caregivers such as legal counsel, referrals to other resources. And so we chose to group this as a direct legal services strategy. So we have our goal up top here. And generally we have like the approach the organization takes to achieve this goal. But what happens in between, right? Because we don't go directly from education straight to caregivers of color being treated equitably, right? So since it's not a straight line, we are going to look at the next thing, which is outcomes. And for simplicity's sake, we're just going to focus on part of the theory of change here so as not to overwhelm. Okay, so honestly, we did the easy parts. The goal and strategies are usually easy to articulate, but now we come to outcomes, which is probably the messiest. So what outcomes do is they really express the results that your program or initiative intends to achieve if it's implemented as planned. So outcomes are really, you could think of it as the changes that occur or the difference that you're making for the individuals or groups or communities or systems that you're trying to affect. So they really reflect the core achievements you hope for your initiative. You can almost think of them as like scaffolding of changes that builds up to your goal, since we kind of like agree that it can't just be linear from your strategies to your goal. Just as a side note too, outcomes are different from outputs. And I just wanted to make this clear because sometimes they're used interchangeably and the difference can be a little esoteric. But outputs are essentially direct products or actions of your activities rather than changes resulting from those actions. So like they may describe how many times you did something over a certain period of time, for example. Whereas I would say an outcome is a level up from that. It's like, how did you doing that thing that many times affect the people you're trying to affect? Okay, so let's look at our example. So the questions here we're asking are, before arriving at the goal, what changes will we see in our community or population or ecosystem? And who and what could change and how could they change? So to make this a little easier, we kind of looked at outcomes through 3 timeframes: short, interim, and long-term outcomes. So just as a note, timeframes like this are highly dependent on the work that you're doing and what the theory of change is describing. So if it's your organization work in general, the timeframes are probably like more long-term. But if you were making a theory of change for maybe just a program, like they might be a little shorter term. And we didn't really define short-term, interim, long-term here. It's more just conceptually helpful. Okay, so let's take a look at short-term first. So after receiving a service or engaging with the organization, what do we hope to see change among caregivers of color? So in the context of our example, let's say we're thinking probably like 3-ish months out, less than a year, of like what happens to people after they go through a training. So in our example, we determined that we want to see increased referrals to legal services from organizations that receive trainings, and to see people who receive trainings to be seeking like more legal services. So then we can think about interim goals, and here we're thinking maybe, I don't know, 6 to a year out, like 6 months to a year out. What are we expecting to see among participants? So we're thinking like participants in trainings have access to legal services. How are we hoping they are changed next? So with our client, we determined that here we expected participants to gain more knowledge and awareness related to the intersection of caregiving and work and their rights. So we posit that this is maybe as a result of coming in more contact with legal services and having some time to apply the training knowledge to their own experience and workplace. So we would expect to see this after some of the short-term outcomes and before some of the longer-term outcomes, which we'll get to next. So thinking long-term, at least like pretty big parts of our goal have been achieved. But we're going to get a little more specific in how that looks and how it's connected to short and interim outcomes. So here we're hoping that community members have also grown their awareness and knowledge of the intersection of care and work, maybe as a result of being in contact with program participants. So this is what a theory of change may look like. And just as a reminder, this is just one branch of the theory of change that we made for the client. We edited out like the others, I don't know, maybe 3 to 4 strategies, and then all the outcomes that come from that, just for simplicity's sake. So also, just as a note, I know this may look very linear right now, but that's also partly because we're only looking at a portion of the theory of change. The full one has more arrows connecting multiple strategies and outcomes, which makes it look a little different. Okay. We have our theory of change, and you may think we're done, but we're not. So now what you have to do is you just like put your theory of change down on paper, and now you have to question everything about it. So really, theories of change are often going to summarize things that are often like already assumed or known by your organization, but making them explicit and articulating them can really help you better understand them. So here it's really important to examine and record assumptions to mitigate confusion and misalignment in decision-making and strengthen shared understanding among like staff and people who work within your organization. So for example, for strategies, like if we're looking at our education one, we may be thinking, okay, what are the conditions that must be true for us to achieve the outcomes we expect from our activities and strategies? What barriers are in the way? As an example here, we pulled out some of the assumptions that we recorded with our client. So if we're thinking again about the education strategy, we're putting it down for us to achieve the outcomes that came from it and that we saw. We're really assuming that the trainings we're doing are accessible and people who are taking them are understanding them, right? They're able to take the time to attend, the content is accessible to them. If this wasn't true, then we would not be able to achieve any of the subsequent outcomes in our theory of change. So it's a fundamental assumption that underscores our strategy in that sense. Uncovering assumptions, though, does not mean the assumption is true. And this is where like we can use potentially evaluation to test some of our assumptions and like to make sure that what we're thinking is actually correct. So finally, just want to briefly discuss who should be involved in creating the theory of change. So ideally, like you would allow a real diversity of staff and organizational actors to contribute or review drafts like during the process. Like some organizations even solicit community input, which is great. Because essentially who you want to involve is the people closest to the work because they know the work best. And this is why it's really important to have input from people like on the ground carrying out your organizational work and not just having leadership designing this. We want to be practical though. And you can't involve everyone at all times. Like people simply do not have the capacity to do that. So what we've seen work well is, for example, having a working group who kind of owns the theory of change process. and like solicits feedback at various predetermined points from other staff. So, I mean, as I said before, we know that people doing the work are often swamped and they don't have the capacity to like fully like be involved in the theory of change stuff. So that's why we kind of suggest a group that can facilitate that process. And then finally, going back to when we asked you when the last time was you revisited your theory of change, ideally, we think a theory of change should not be static, and it should be like updated at regular intervals throughout an initiative or your work. The frequency at which you do that is left up to you. Simply, our guidance is just that we don't want it to collect dust, because if it's not updated, it gets outdated and then it's not useful to you anymore. So here, I just shared a few more resources for you on theories of change, including some ways to make visuals. Honestly, like we use PowerPoint all the time. It's super reliable. And even though I shared some ways of like making it visual, I would just want to say too, like you've probably seen super polished visuals of theories of change, and they're like really cute graphics, but it honestly does not have to be that refined. Your theory of change like can be super simple. It can even be a narrative, so it doesn't have to be visual, honestly. But these are just some resources if you're interested. And I will pass it over to Rebecca.
So in this section, we want to share some guidance for formulating approachable and relevant evaluation questions. And we'll also talk a little bit about evaluation plans as a way for you to organize yourself to answer evaluation questions. So after you've developed a theory of change, which Corey walked you through, you now have a model for the change that you're hoping your work can contribute to. You have the assumptions that are underlying this model, and you really should have a better understanding of how you're thinking about your work. And so we think that will then put you in a good place to start asking focused questions that, when you answer them, should help improve your interventions and better communicate your impact. And so as you can see in this graphic of the life cycle of an evaluation, all evaluations start with a question. And so evaluation questions, these are really the high level questions that your evaluation is designed to answer. And they're why you're collecting information on something. So often we find, and you may find this too, that people collect a bunch of data and then don't do anything with it. Which again is why we suggest that you should only collect what you need to collect in order to answer your evaluation questions. And also, you probably are already asking a lot of these questions. A lot of it, again, is just thinking about reframing them as evaluation questions and then systematizing how you approach those questions and how you approach answering those questions. And developing a theory of change is great also because it will help you figure out what questions to ask. So some of the questions might be as simple as asking if you're actually achieving some of the outcomes that you have listed in your theory of change, and then tracking progress toward those outcomes. And there are many different types of evaluation questions. A common way of categorizing them is by process questions and outcome questions. And so a process question can focus on how a program or intervention or piece of work is working. And then an outcome question is more looking at what happened as a result of the program or intervention or piece of work. And so process questions, they're looking at, it could be, how did the actual intervention implementation compare to your initial plan? What changed and why? What challenges did people encounter when trying to access our service? In the theory of change example that we shared, so one evaluation question we developed with the client related to process was, how accessible are our services to our target demographic? which also was a way to test one of the assumptions that Corey talked about like if the services are accessible. And then outcome questions could look at things like who did the intervention serve? What did participants report as the most impactful part of our service? Looking at to what extent participants' attitudes have changed after an intervention. And an example from the Theory of Change project that we talked through was looking at how and to what extent have we met training participants' needs, including increasing their awareness and knowledge about their rights. So also similar to when you're developing a theory of change, when you're developing evaluation questions, you'll want to think about the assumptions that are being made in the questions you're asking, including what assumptions you're making about the change your work is expected to contribute to. And then also similarly to the theory of change process, we find that it can be very useful to define the key terms that are in your question. So, really looking at each word, are there certain terms that could plausibly be defined differently by different groups and therefore be clarified by having a singular agreed upon definition? Good thing, if you've gone through the theory of change process, you probably have already defined some of these terms in the theory of change process. So like in the second question in this outcome question example, you could perhaps define terms like increased awareness and knowledge, and also rights. And so once you have your questions, it's time to get organized about answering them. And so for this, you can use an evaluation plan or a matrix. And again, this is not the only way to approach this, but we find that this is a common approach and it can be pretty convenient too. And so each evaluation question will go into this plan. And really, it's a way to help you think through, once you have your questions, what outcomes that you have developed in your theory of change, like what outcomes each question are tied to, what indicators could be useful to answer this question, and then where you're obtaining the data to answer the question, how you will collect the data, how you will analyze the data once it's collected. You can also include how the answer to the question may affect future decision-making. You can also include a time component. So when would data collection or analysis happen? And also who is doing the data collection? And it sounds like a lot of things, but it also, we find it's a way to sort of reality check like what you've developed, because putting it all in one place can then help you see maybe you have too many questions, maybe there's too many outcomes or too many data collection methods, or you're relying too much on one staff member to collect and analyze all the data. So it can also just be a helpful way to like put everything in one place and see if what you've created is actually realistic and feasible. And so it's just consolidating all this thinking in one place and helping you move to action. And then, so in this example that we have here, this is from the theory of change example again. So you see we've sort of laid out with the short-term outcomes, indicators that are linked to that, and then the data collection methods that it's going to be collected quarterly, and who is using it and when they're using it and why they're using it. So it's, it's just like a little chart. And Interact for Health actually has a template, and they are also very happy to work with all of you to help you develop an evaluation plan. So there are lots of resources out there. There's lots of guidance on how to write good evaluation questions, different ways of thinking about asking questions. But we would suggest reaching out to Interact for Health as well. And I will turn it over to Corey to talk about indicators.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I need to emphasize, please reach out to Interact for Health because it is a pure luxury to have someone provide you with free evaluation help. Cool. So as hinted at when Rebecca was showing you the evaluation matrix, we may want to use some indicators that help answer some of our evaluation questions, or at least track our progress towards them. So what are indicators? Generally, they're quantitative data. They're usually not the answer to like your evaluation question in and of themselves, but they're a way to measure and communicate about your work. And they're really great usually to like track over time and to monitor your work and conduct comparisons over time, for example. So they can be tied to specific evaluation questions, but at the same time, you probably also have some indicators that you're going to track no matter what, because they're tied to your theory of change in an ongoing manner. So like maybe you don't have an active evaluation question about some of your outcomes, but it's still important for you to like kind of track something tangible so that you can see if you're getting closer to achieving this outcome or like how progress for the outcome is going. One thing I'll just caveat right off the bat is indicators should not be the only way you track your work. And in fact, quantitative indicators are just inherently limited because it's reducing a lot of your complex work to a number ultimately. You may have lots of really useful numbers, but ultimately it's a number. So think about how you also typically communicate your own impact about your work. And I bet you're going to incorporate a lot of like constituent stories too. And those are really, really, really important. And we're not trying to diminish that here. Just to give you a little transparency and like why we're talking about indicators versus like how to do an interview is just like we wanted to make a choice to focus on indicators because we know they're hard to design. And they're also like really convenient despite their limitations. And they can like give you like a little snapshot of your work and make it really easy to communicate with people outside your organization. And so while very rich, like stories and qualitative data is like super time intensive. And so like this is where we're kind of weighing that against indicators, which like are kind of more convenient. I mean, a lot of the time too, like we get hired because people do not have the time to process amounts of qualitative data. So that's how time intensive it can get. So that is all to say that us focusing on indicators today is not in any way to diminish the value of qualitative data. It's just a trade-off that we made for this presentation. Okay, another mentee question. So I'd love to know, like, what are some indicators that you currently use to track or measure your work? And you can use the QR code again to scan, or you can join based on the link in the chat. Meaningful interactions, I love that. Yep. Community participation, yep. Number of program services provided. Great. So it sounds like based on some of the answers, you're all well on your way to like measuring a lot of your work, which is amazing. And again, just reiterating what Rebecca said at the beginning is honestly, evaluation is all about framing. You are definitely already doing evaluative activities. It's just about how you think about it and how systematic you are in answering these questions. Oops. Yes. Greenhouse gas emission reduction. Awesome. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing. So just to start us off with indicators, a really useful tool that we've used before is this matrix, and it's used to classify and design indicators based on what they're measuring, essentially. So the matrix here really looks at indicators and how they measure effort and effect across quantity and quality. So the acronyms in each quadrant give examples of what indicators may measure if they fall within it. And this is based on results-based accountability methodology, which we link to here if you want to learn more about it. So just as a note too, when we say effort here, we mean like the effort of the organization generally. And so the focus is on what the org has been doing or has done. This is kind of implied in the question in the top two quadrants, which says which focus on the how much did we do, which here we interpret more as like people within the organization. Effect, on the other hand, really focuses on the change in participants of the program or the intervention. Like, how are they better off? How might they have changed? So let's take a look at how we might develop some indicators from our previous workplace rights example. And these are not indicators they necessarily use. We kind of came up with these for this presentation. So if we're focused on understanding and tracking our education strategy, as we did before in the theory of change, we could look at it through a few different lenses. So we could look at it kind of through effort and quantity. So here we're asking how much did we do? And literally this could just be the number of trainings we put on. We might ask how well did we do these trainings? And here we can imagine that we're asking like for feedback from participants. So maybe their feedback scores are a good indicator to track our quality here. So then we can pivot to thinking about how the training might have affected participants. We're asking a question like, is anyone better off? How many people did we actually train could be a good indicator. So you'll notice that if we just count how many sessions we're giving, it really doesn't tell us if anyone's attending, right? So how many people are attending the training session is a slightly better indicator of like some of what you're accomplishing with your work, right? And then we can also look at it across effect and quality. So this might look like how many people who attended reported learning something useful or having increased knowledge of their rights. So at this point, like we could also push this indicator further and think about like how many people are asking for accommodations at their workplace after the training, but that can also get harder to track. So as you probably suspect, generally like this bottom portion of the matrix is going to be more interesting and yield more powerful indicators for your communication because it talks about the effect you are having. It's not to say that the top indicators aren't important because they are in like many, many ways. But if you were communicating about your work, talking about the number of people trained and what they got from the training is going to be probably more powerful, right? Okay, so we've developed some indicators and now we'd like to assess if they're any good. So one way to help you think about this is looking at the indicator across these three forms of power. So not all indicators are created equal. And so we can look at them through communication power, proxy power, and data power. So communication power here is your indicator easy to understand? And does it have like clarity with a range of audiences? Like, how well an indicator measures up here is really dependent on the audience you're communicating to. Proxy power really speaks to how meaningful the indicator is. So does it tell us necessary and important information about our progress towards our goals? These might be like, are the indicators good proxies for measuring something important to your work? For example, like number of people accessing legal services after a training may be a proxy for the quality of the training itself. Or a change in people's behaviors. And then finally, we can look at indicators based on data power, which is my indicator going to be reliable and consistent? If you have a great indicator, but you don't have access to reliable data for it, it may not actually be that great. Like, I think there's so many things that I would love information on that just isn't out there. And while it would be amazing to be able to track work that way, it's not feasible. So that's that tells you too, like whether or not an indicator is going to work for you. Like for example, like a really useful indicator might be % of participants who felt empowered after training to leave a workplace that violated their rights. Like that might be an amazing indicator. And if you could like tie that to some of your work, that could be really useful. But if you're getting this data, let's say through a survey and participants just tend to ignore those, and that's your only way of accessing that data, then maybe this is not an indicator that you'd be able to track or have the capacity to track. Cool. So all this to say too is that an indicator does not have to be strong like across all criteria, and they often honestly aren't. So sometimes proxy power may be low, but it may be the only reliable or available data that you have, so the indicator has to do. Or maybe the communication power is low, so like it's not super easy to understand to various audiences, but the indicator is necessary because you have to report on it for like funding or to fulfill like certain reporting requirements. So if that's the case, yeah, you have to track that indicator. So these criteria are important, but they're also not the full picture of when you're picking out what to track, obviously. So let's look at some examples. So if we're thinking about like feedback scores for training sessions, so here we're thinking, okay, comms power should be pretty high. Like it's easy to understand, high score, we're doing well, right? For our proxy power here, we're thinking, I don't know, maybe medium low. Having more sessions is important. It probably means more people can attend, but doesn't really tell us if anyone is attending and what they're getting out of it. And then we're thinking this might be high. Oh, I think I mixed them up. I think this should apply to the number of people or whatever. You know what I'm saying. We think like this is probably high in terms of data power because you can track this data very easily. And we also evaluated 2 other indicators along these criteria as an example. But note too that like this is very subjective and more of a tool for you to just think through the indicators rather than an absolute way of classifying them. So depending on your audiences too, the power of each indicator may change. Like if your audience is someone who's like intimately familiar with your work, a lot of indicators may just score really high on communication power because they know what you're going to talk about no matter how complex it gets. If you're talking with someone who's only like familiar in passing, like maybe that same indicator would score low with them. So yeah, like for example, staff from your organization can probably have like pretty high tolerance for like complex indicators, but it might not make as much sense for people outside the organization. Of course, though, you generally want to make indicators that most people can understand, but this is just an example to show that 2 people may look at the same indicator and classify them differently. So really, this is more like just something to think through. So to close out this section, just had a few thoughts. So first, when designing indicators, know that there are just no right number of indicators. And as Rebecca said, we really recommend that you only track what you need and have the capacity to use. Anything else is frankly a waste of time a lot of the time. If you don't lose it, you should just lose it. Because it's eating up your resources for something that you're not using. Second, when you're coming up with indicators, we also find it's important, as with evaluation questions and with the theory of change, and this is a thread throughout the whole presentation, to question the underlying assumptions and to ideally make sure the measures would make sense to the people your work is supporting, which kind of comes back to the principle of using evaluation as center and advance equity. So like, who is defining success through these indicators? Would people you are supporting agree with this indicator? Those can be some really important questions to ask as well. And then like, as you go back to work after this session, we have a few other questions that we'd like you to mull over. So for example, as we saw when you shared your indicators that you're already tracking, you are already tracking a lot of data. So like, how do they compare along some of the power criteria we shared? How could they be improved if you see that it's low on certain power metrics? And then if it indicator scores low on everything, maybe ask yourself, does it need to be tracked? Maybe not. And then another good consideration for a good indicator that's hinted at here is kind of the effort and burden of tracking it. Is it worth the knowledge that it's giving you? So maybe you can track something, it's okay, but if it honestly takes too much effort to get that data, it might not be worth what you're getting back out of it. So that's indicators. And we're going to talk about data collection in a bit, but for indicators, you're probably going to be collecting data through surveys like event attendance, inventory, or like your internal databases. We're not really going to go over these methods here in the next section because they're common, and frankly, like there are a ton of resources out there about them, like from people who have way more expertise in them than us. So instead, for data collection, we're going to try to share something a little different. And as always, if you want to know more about indicators, we have resources here. And I will turn it over to Rebecca.
Great. So we really want to just leave you with some ideas for capturing important data without necessarily overhauling or introducing new data systems and structures to your work. We often find that teams hold and generate data all the time, and this data can be used with a little bit of a reframe. And we'll also share one way that we find helpful for reflecting on data. And so, indicators, what Corey just talked about, and the data you gather to track them are just one aspect of the information we'll need to fully answer our evaluation questions. And like Corey said, we kind of want to set aside some of the more common methods, like interviews, focus groups, surveys. There's a lot of information out there, and frankly, like we wouldn't have enough time to really do them justice. Like you can take multi-day courses on surveys, for example. So we really wanted to talk more about ways to collect data that are more integrated into your day-to-day work. Like anything can be data if you're capturing it systematically. And so, you probably generate a lot of data just in staff meetings or simple interactions with people you're supporting through your work. Many things happen in meetings that aren't necessarily written down, and then they're not considered when it comes time to talk about, reflect on, or report on your work. And so really part of collecting data can just be becoming more intentional in the spaces and meetings where staff and other organizational actors already gather. So for example, do you have recurring staff meetings, or do you have planning meetings or meeting with partners where you can start to systematically capture information? And so we're going to talk about two tools. One is learning logs, and the other is before and after action reviews. And so the first tool is, yes, and they're, like I said, yeah, they're more integrated into the everyday work, which is why I want to focus on them. So the first tool is a learning log. And so what is a learning log? It's really a systematic way of capturing challenges, successes, experiments that your organization is undertaking in real time, so that you can come back to reflect on them as a team. And learning logs also give you a repository to pull from when it comes time to articulate what you have been working on and achieved. And this example is an example from a project that we worked on. It's basically just an Excel spreadsheet. That's the spoiler. It's really like, that's why we like it though, because it is so simple. And so, we like learning logs for a bunch of reasons, but the idea is like all team members can contribute to it. It makes sure that important events or insights don't fall through the cracks because there is one place where everything is captured. And then it's also, you're meeting as a team, you're revisiting it periodically to reflect on what you're learning, emerging themes, or perhaps things that have changed since you documented these events. And then the reflection can be part of a standing meeting. You don't have to set a dedicated time specifically for this. And so this example, right, the one you're looking at, all the cells are filled out, but they don't have to be filled out for every entry. It just depends on what you're capturing. And so it also doesn't have to be in this format. It should be in whatever format is most useful to you. But things that it could include would be, the date, who's filling it out, the event or activity that you are reporting on, if there are significant achievements related to that, any key insights about experiments or successes or challenges. You can include a place to link notes related to the event. You could include next steps, really anything that you deem relevant to you. So it doesn't have to look exactly like this with exactly these columns in there. This example is just an example from a team that was documenting their reflections about an annual convening that they had. And so they wanted to pull out some key achievements, some experiments they were undertaking related to that, and then things that they want to keep the same or factors of success. And then, yeah, like you can also tag it. So you can see in this column D, there's a couple different topics. And so once you start to populate the learning log over time, let's say you want to then look back at anything that was related to relationship building, for example, maybe in your evaluation questions, like one of your questions is about building relationships. So then you could filter by that and then go back and look at anything that was tagged that was related to that topic. And so another tool that we find useful are before and after action reflections. These are really just simple sets of questions, but we find they can help a team create a shared vision of what success would look like, and then reflect collectively on how to improve. And so before action reflections, kind of what it sounds like. It's a set of questions that, it allows teams to think about what you're hoping for prior to the beginning of a program or an intervention, or even like a piece of work or an event. It will help you anticipate challenges and also define success collectively. And then an after action reflections is a set of questions that you then use to think through how the work went, what could be improved, what went well, and if the results aligned with the results that you outlined at the beginning in your before action reflection. And even more simply, it's just asking what happened, so what, and what next. And we like these because you can integrate these questions into, if you have a kickoff meeting for a project or a closeout meeting for a project or an event, you can really just go through these questions in that meeting. And then it also integrates well with the learning log, because what you're talking about and what you're reflecting on through these questions, you can then capture it and document it in the learning log. And so, some final thoughts on data collection, which again, I feel like we've sort of stressed all these points throughout, is like, don't do more than you have to. So it can be tempting to collect a bunch of data. Maybe you're really excited after this training and you want to like gather everything, but you should try not to do more than you have to. It can really easily become unwieldy and then also not useful if you're attempting to do too much. And then, you don't need to do time-intensive surveys or analysis. If you have standing meetings or regular interactions with people you're supporting, you can think of things you could ask them that you could then record as data. So like one simple example would be, you could ask people to rate their experience with the training. So the training example that we gave, you could say, how would you rate your experience from 1 to 5? And then that becomes a way to quantify qualitative data. And if you're collecting it systematically, you can track this data point, but also, write it down with data from other conversations as well. And then lastly, we believe that the people who are doing the work are the best placed people to gather data with and from. You all and the people you work with are going to know what will be most useful. And so once you've collected all this data, so you have the data, in your learning log, you've collected it through your before and after action reflections. It's really important to engage with it. So again, that's also why we recommend only collecting what you can realistically use. And reflecting on the data, it can be a simple process. So one tool that we like to use just involves reviewing the data and then asking sort of a series of questions. So you start with the data and you ask, what additional stories can we add? How well do our experiences and observations align with the data? So you're really looking at the data, but also bringing your own stories and insights to it collectively, like as a team. And then you're then looking at the insights and asking, what patterns are we seeing and what insights are emerging? So really it's making meaning from the data and the stories. And then shifting to the next quadrant is the hypotheses. So asking, what will it take to make us successful moving forward? And so this is where you can talk about your ideas about what to do now. And then really moving to action and asking, when can we test our new thinking? And so this is, identifying opportunities to test out your thinking. And again, always ask who should be involved in these conversations. So when you reflect on data, make sure that the right people are involved. So if decisions or actions that arise from these data will affect a group, we think that's a good sign that they should also be involved in interpreting and reflecting on the data. And when you reflect on your learning log, this can be a good process to use. And then one other sort of logistical tip is that when you are doing these reflections, we find it helpful to have someone assigned the role of facilitator so they can really focus on asking the probing questions. But again, because we said you don't need to be a professional evaluator or hire someone external to do it. If you are doing it internally, make sure that that person, if they're involved in the work, also has space to provide their own insights. So one way to do that is just to rotate the facilitator role within a reflection session. And there's a lot of other resources. The Emergent Learning is a great resource. That's where a lot of these tools that we just talked about came from. And we have this tiny little learning log template that we created that you can modify as you see fit. But there's a lot of information out there. And so, we're almost done. It's been a lot. We've provided you with a lot of content, but we wanted to leave you with a couple parting ideas. And again, this is all to say, yes, we covered a lot, but we barely scratched the surface of evaluation. There's so many ways that people do evaluation. There were all those frameworks we showed you at the very beginning, and that's only a small number of them. And there's also no exact right way to engage with it, and there's no formula that's going to work all the time. So if you take away anything from today, we really hope it's the importance of remaining flexible, realistic, and iterative when you are doing evaluation. Evaluation can seem like this really big thing, but you don't have to do everything all at once. Like, we really hope you take what works for you, and go from there. And, you know, while you're taking what works for you, you also have this great resource in Interact for Health. So they can help you develop an evaluation plan. They can help you be a thought partner for you in your evaluative work. So please reach out to Michelle. They would love to help you. And because we are evaluators, we would like to ask you a few more questions. And you can join the Menti again. So compared to the beginning of the session, if you agree or disagree with this statement, I feel more comfortable with evaluation. Great. Well, we're glad that you feel more comfortable. It was just the beginning though. But and then we have one more question. And honestly, if you only answer one question this session, we'd like to put a plug for answering this one. This is helpful for Interact for Health as well. We hope it can support future programming and support that's made available for you. So we'll give you a couple minutes, or like a minute, to answer this question that's a little more in depth. But what other topics would you like to cover within evaluation? What other questions do you have? What resources do you need to do more evaluation?
Oh my God, if you figure out a strategy to increase survey responses, please tell us.
That was a tough one.
Yep, dashboards is huge too.
Mm-hmm.
And we here love data visualization, so that's something we're always thinking about as well. Awesome.
This is great. Yeah, like a deep dive on a couple types of evaluation. Yeah.
Favorite data viz tools? Oh yeah, we can share that too.
Yeah, this is great. So yes, continue to answer that one in the Menti. And then this is just sort of our parting question to you. You don't have to answer it, but to think about, you know, what is one action you can take right away to start your evaluation work or improve your evaluation work?
We don't need an answer to that. Just something for
no,
you to
you don't need to. You don't need to answer that now. Just something to think about. And again, you know, we will share slides. We'll share this recording. We also are going to send out a very brief survey for your feedback that we'll use to inform future trainings. We'll drop a link into the chat as well, so you have that, but we'll also email it out too.
For the person who wants to increase their survey responses, please answer this and model what you want to see in the world.
Oh, this is great. Someone has a suggestion about, yes, stipend or rewarding survey responses with a tangible token of appreciation, understanding the valuable level of expertise by end users. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
That's really great.
That's also definitely something we've done before. I think almost every survey we do, we try to incentivize in some way. Not this one, unfortunately, but yeah, it is a great idea. And I think it does drive up survey responses. Awesome. We also have 9 more minutes. So if you had any questions that you wanted us to maybe tackle, we're happy to do so right now. Since we have a little extra time. I'll stop sharing. And if not, thank you so much for being here. We love sharing all the work we do. And of course, please feel free to reach out to us as well as Interact for Health.